actually running from his assailant.
To bring the man justice, detectives must rely on a bizarre clue.
They dropped this.
It says breakdancing contest 1984. Well now.
Then, a hailstorm of bullets rains down on a welcome home party.
Don't you down on me? My brother was shot. It was very scary.
It's up to Kenda to determine which of the guests had it in for the host.
Richard was trying to do the right thing, coming to the defense of his cousin.
A strong resemblance?
That's him.
You can run, but you're going to have to answer for this. No one deserves to die at someone's hand. Nobody gets to play God. Nobody gets to do that.
It's 1:30 in the morning. Jackie Waldo was manning the drive-up window at this fast food restaurant.
Can I take your order, please?
Yeah, can I get an order of fries?
Okay, fries. You want small, medium, or large?
Yeah, can we get 5 large?
Okay, 5 orders of super fries.
The bars are just closing and people want to stop and get something to eat.
Drive up to the window, please. Can I take your order?
Yo, what is that guy's problem? What the hell?
Hello, is everything all right?
That's it!
She realized that there's a brawl going on out here.
Hey, you can't do that here! You need to get out of here!
Messed up now!
She's probably thinking, oh great, it's just some more unruly people coming through and nothing that she hasn't seen or dealt with before.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Well, when Jackie is able to see what's going on, she sees someone lying on the pavement, basically bleeding to death.
Jack! Jack!
Oh my God, help!
Not far away, Lieutenant Joe Kenda is on his way home after an exhausting day on the job.
You begin to believe that, well, maybe we've finally put everyone to rest. Maybe now everybody's satisfied. They've stabbed enough people. They've shot enough people. Maybe they're just going to go to bed. You start to go home and the radio cracks.
Dispatch to 4 Paul 1.
Go for 4 Paul 1.
Have a report of a stabbing at 375 Academy Boulevard.
10-4, I'll be there in less than 10 minutes.
So maybe they're not done for the day yet. Let's go over there and see what's going on.
Hey, Sarge.
So we got?
We got a stabbing. Victim is Jack Martinez, 29, pronounced DOA at the hospital.
Well, someone heck of a knife fight.
It is rare to have a stabbing result in a dead on arrival. They had to hit something very vital.
Unfortunately, when we got here, it was a ghost town. Just the drive-through cashier, which really didn't see anything. One other person. Victim was actually with another guy during the fight. He got roughed up a bit, so we sent him out of the hospital.
When the police arrive, red lights and siren, everybody runs. They want no part of this. Whether they were involved in it or not, everybody split like a covey of quail.
Now, let's make sure the witnesses don't disappear. Want to point me to where the body was at?
You're gonna love this.
Is that what I think it is?
That's Davidson. It's his 3rd day, first homicide.
The body's now gone, but there's a chalk outline drawn on the pavement where he'd been laying.
Let's call him over.
Davidson.
It's your first homicide?
Yes, sir.
As a young officer, so I thought you're supposed to do, no, we're not supposed to do that. They do that in the movies, and they did it in the 1930s, but that was a long time ago. We use photography, measurements, and that sort of thing, so you don't need that.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
No, you got in any trouble. You just might want to skip that next time to avoid some grief.
Yes, sir.
You don't yell at them. You just tell them the reality is we don't put the chalk outline around the body. So just keep that in mind.
Now, let me see what we got here.
There are broken beer bottles and rocks and all sorts of things laying all over the place. Obviously, the remains of a large fight.
Where are the witnesses at?
We've got them waiting over here.
Why don't you try the drive-through cashier? I'll see what the bystander has to say.
Yes, sir.
He was a 20-year-old young man by the name of Matty Marr, who just happened to be walking home from work when this altercation takes place in the parking lot.
You told the officers you saw what happened?
Yeah, it was really weird. They were all in this black Jeep. There was a car right behind them, and they were just honking and honking. That's what made me look in that direction. And then all of a sudden, these guys get out of the Jeep, and they just went off on them. It was kind of surreal.
Surreal how?
And they're all wearing the same exact thing.
One thing he vividly remembers is a group of Mexican males, and the way he remembers them specifically is that they were all dressed identically. They had black shirts on and white pants, and you're thinking, okay, are they dressed in costume?
Is this a group of guys from a band at a nightclub, or, why are they all dressed the same?
You think you could identify these guys in a lineup?
I don't know, after that dude got stabbed, they all took off quickly. But they dropped this.
Now, what's that? He pulls out a blue ribbon, and it says, State of Colorado Breakdancing Contest Finalist 1984. Well, now, here's our matching outfits. They are dancers.
Oh, this is very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
It's always embarrassing when you watch criminals act and engage in crime that they're so disconnected, so disoriented, and so stupid that it's almost the same thing as dropping their driver's license at the crime scene. We're not going to go to a ballroom dancing group. We're going to go find the break dancers. We're investigating the death of Jack Martinez, killed during a fight in a fast food restaurant at 1:30 in the morning. One foot in front of the other leads us to a breakdancing group.
Well, this was 1984, and back then breakdancing was very popular. It was something that everybody was doing. So these competitions would come to town, and a lot of people would participate.
Before following up on this lead, Kenda needs to learn more about the victim.
Where are these wounds and what did they do? So we do go to the autopsy.
Hey, Doc. Oh, hey, Sarge. How are you? Good. Have you made any determination on Jack Martinez?
Yes, just getting started on that. Saw several stab wounds, looked pretty deep. If I were guessing, I'd say one of those stab wounds punctured his aorta.
He bled to death in less than a minute. He was dead before the ambulance got there.
Also noticed contusions around his face and on his hands. Looked like he was in quite a brawl. Here's the personal effects. It's not much.
Check this out.
Jack Martinez has cash on his person, not a great deal, but he does have money, 20-some odd dollars. This isn't robbery, this is a confrontation. It's a fight.
There was a military ID card, which indicated that he was a soldier, possibly stationed out at Fort Carson.
Why don't you go ahead and take this down to the station? I'm gonna go see if they're ready to release this guy's buddy.
Will do.
This person was identified as a 23-year-old Jeffrey Nostrom, who was also a soldier out at Fort Carson and was very good friends with our victim, Jack Martinez.
I give you guys a minute.
Jeffrey, I'm Sergeant Kenda.
Jack didn't deserve this.
He says, besides being a soldier, Jack comes from a very large, loving family. Here you have a son who's serving his country in the military. And what happens, he gets attacked in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant in a relatively safe community.
We were just having a good time until all this went down.
Can you tell me how you got to the drive-thru?
They decide that the bars are about to close and that they're hungry, and they go to the fast food outlet, the nearest place that's open that serves food.
What the hell? How long does it take these guys to order? I mean, honestly, this is a fast food place.
Slow down, man. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Well, I'm starving, and they are taking all night, so... let's go! Come on!
So he just reached over and honked, that's it?
Yeah, I mean, he was being a little rude, whatever. But after that, they went crazy.
Honestly, this is gonna take absolutely forever. All right, you know what? So, come on! Yo, what's up?
Some of them jump on their car, they're pounding it, and it's like all this melee starts all of a sudden.
Like they just ran at us like they wanted to fight, you know? And
That's how you got that.
yeah, and he messed up my car too. Like, just because somebody honked,
Did you get a look at him?
I guess. Like they were all Hispanic. They had on white pants and black shirt. It's like they were all waiters or on a team or something, you know?
That's consistent with what the other witnesses are saying. All right, well, I'll be in touch. I'm sorry about your friend.
Early the next morning, Kenda rejoins his colleague, Detective Jones, to follow up with the site of the dance competition.
CSPD, we're looking for the organizer of this event.
Hi, can I help you?
And we meet a woman named Emily Moffat who reports that she was the manager of the competition.
It seems that 4 of the winners of your competition were involved in an incident that we're investigating. We believe they're finalists.
That's just a participation prize. Well, 19X got that.
Would you be able to identify them based on the costumes they had on?
There was a news crew here that taped the entire thing.
She did say, well, wait a minute, though. We do have some news footage. We could take a look at that and maybe help you find these 4 individuals that you're looking for.
Steve, do you have that tape the news crew gave us?
Yeah, I'm fired up.
In the back room of the city auditorium, they had the equipment necessary to play the tape. We started looking at the different contestants, checking for that outfit.
Well, that's not them. They don't fit the description. They were looking for black shirts and white pants.
Wait, that could be them.
Number 7? That's the Robotronic Playboys.
I'm sorry?
That's what they call themselves.
They call themselves the Robotronic Playboys, which I guess if you're 16, that sounds like a great name. And this woman says, I have a list that has all of the names of that group. Now that would be delightful. We've managed to narrow this down very quickly indeed, down to a small group of kids with a stupid name for a dance group, one of whom happens to be a killer. We're investigating the death of Jack Martinez, killed during a fight in a fast food restaurant at 1:30 in the morning. One foot in front of the other leads us to a breakdancing group.
They indicated that these 4 people were identified as Peter Chavez, Alan Cortez, Rob, and Michael Martinez.
You wouldn't happen to have their addresses or phone numbers, would you?
Most of our dance crews parked in our lot. In order to do that, they had to give us license plate numbers.
We'd love to see those receipts.
Excuse me.
She finds a parking receipt for a black Jeep with the name Hector Garcia attached to it.
That was a gold mine. We could run that registration and find out who that vehicle belongs to and where that person lives.
All right, thank you very much.
Armed with the names of the dance team members and the registration of the car they arrived in, Kenda returns to the station.
Hey, Sarge. Ran all those names. Seems like none of them have any kind of a record.
What about the car? Did you run those tags?
Here's the address. Based on those plates, it's like you thought. The owner is Hector Garcia. He's up in Denver.
All right, thank you.
This is something that if the roles were reversed and Denver was looking for somebody in Colorado Springs, they could call us.
We contact Detective Roland, Denver PD. Could he send an officer by at our request to determine if a black Jeep is parked in front of this address?
But when Denver police arrive at the address, there's no sign of the vehicle.
And nobody answered the doorbell. So they decided, well, you know what? We're going to set up a surveillance on this residence and see if the person in that black Jeep returns home in the next hour or so.
Nothing yet, guys. Still on hold.
And that's exactly what happened.
Gentlemen, I have a visual. This looks like our guy. Go, go, go.
Let me see your hands.
You Hector Garcia?
Yes?
I'd like to ask you some questions in connection with an investigation being run out of Colorado Springs.
Yes, I know.
Oh, you know. Is this because you're involved in this stabbing?
Let's bring him over here. We have a search warrant to search your vehicle. Search your vehicle, please.
We believe we were in the right church and we just found the right pew. They find a switchblade knife. It's a killing knife. It has no other purpose.
We've got Hector Garcia in custody now. We're going to talk to him as quickly as we can. He's going to be the conduit to get us to these other 4 suspects that we're looking for.
Mr. Garcia, we don't have a lot of time. I don't think you had anything to do with the killing, but I'm pretty sure you know who did.
They started it.
Excuse me?
The dudes in the car behind us.
It does not matter who started what in terms of the event when there's a death involved. Starting a fight should not be accompanied by a death penalty.
The guys were just complete assholes, so the crew went to take care of it. But I know what happened was wrong, and Peter went too far.
Hector said the knife was all Peter Chavez, not me.
Yo, man, is that blood? Why the hell did you have to stab him?
I didn't even know he put the knife in my car.
All right, I believe you. But the DA isn't as open-minded as I am. He might decide to go a little lighter on you, though, if you help us find your friends, especially Peter.
Okay, yeah, I'll help you guys.
With Hector Garcia's cooperation and the assistance of the Denver PD, all the dance team members are located. All, that is, except for one.
The only one that was not brought in was Peter Chavez.
We obtain an arrest warrant for Peter Chavez. We go to serve it in Denver where he lives. We have Denver PD with us for jurisdiction.
Yes.
Is this the home of Peter Chavez?
Yes, it is. What is this about?
His mother answers the door.
Here she had sent her son off to do something he loved. The last thing she ever expected was that he would be questioned by police for a murder.
Sorry, ma'am, there's one more thing. We've got a warrant to search the premises for evidence.
Good Lord.
She is very cooperative, and she remains seated in the living room while we conduct the search.
Is Peter's room down the hall?
Yes, down the hall to the left.
Ma'am, I can't stress this enough. When Peter reaches out to you, and he will, you need to convince him to turn himself in. You don't want us to come looking for him.
I understand.
Detective.
Hector said he wiped the blade on his pants, and there's blood on those pants.
Go ahead and bag him.
That's the final piece of evidence to secure Peter Chavez's conviction for this crime.
We'll be in touch.
Peter Chavez, we're not going to stop until we find him. We are not going to stop.
You're going to put extra police officers on the case to help track down leads of where his associates may be, where his friends may be. All stops are out.
Thanks. Let me know if you hear anything.
All right, so we've talked to most of the performers from that night. Those who know Chavez don't know where he may be.
All right, thanks. Let's keep plugging away, though.
Officer.
Line 3, you're going to want to talk this guy. It's the detective up in Aurora.
Get a phone call from Detective Hogan from the Aurora Police Department, which is a suburb of Denver.
Peter Chavez has walked into the front lobby of their police building in the company of an attorney to surrender himself on an arrest warrant for first-degree murder for Colorado Springs.
On the advice of counsel, Chavez isn't giving a statement. But later that day, detectives receive test results that bolster their case against Chavez and removes any need for further evidence.
That blood on his pants that he wore during the competition matches the blood of our victim, Jack Martinez.
I guess that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks.
He and he alone is responsible for the death of Jack Martinez.
Between the witness statements and the physical evidence, Kenda is able to piece together exactly what happened that night.
Hector Garcia, on the night of the murder, drives his friends from Denver to a breakdancing contest in the city auditorium.
Man, that was a waste of our time. It was. The thing was rigged, bruh.
They receive what they believe is a participation ribbon, and they're right. They don't win anything, and they find this ribbon to be offensive.
Can I take your order, please?
Fries, right?
Yeah. 5 large. 5 large.
Small, medium, or large?
Can we get 5 large?
Okay.
Yo, what's the guy's problem? What the hell? Yo, somebody needs to tell that guy to shut the hell up, yo. Yeah, it's gotta be Jack.
So when they're in line there, they're already frustrated and angry.
Shut the hell up, yo. That's it!
During that fight, Peter Chavez, for reasons known only to himself, takes a switch-bladed knife, puts it in his hand, attacks Jack Martinez from the rear, stabs him 3 times in the back,
Jack Martinez died that night on the pavement of a fast food parking lot.
Jack!
He didn't deserve that.
Unlike Chavez, Hector Garcia, the Martinez brothers, and Alan Cortez are not charged with any crime.
The only thing they did was engage in a misdemeanor fistfight, provoked by someone else. Peter Chavez was retained.
He was charged as an adult with murder in this case. But some people would say 4 years for murdering somebody. Was manslaughter a proper charge in this? Probably was. Peter Chavez didn't go from Denver to Colorado Springs that night with the intent to kill anybody. It wasn't something that was planned.
And in the space of less than a minute, a life is lost and a life is ruined. It's hard to imagine that that's the case, but nothing people do surprises me. It often disappoints me, but it never surprises me.
Coming up, a war of words ends in gunfire, and Kenda has to track down the man responsible.
You can run, but you're gonna have to answer for this.
It's a relatively quiet Tuesday night. Dennis Lucio is kind of nodding off in his easy chair, watching the end of a television show.
Mr. Lucio had decided that he was going to collect up his beer cans and take them outside for recycling. And then heard what he thought were gunshots. He looked out and saw a man lying in the street, and a pool of blood was starting to form.
All these people are running around, and his first thought is, get some help here as quickly as possible.
Dennis Lucio calls 911, and patrolmen quickly arrive on the scene. Not far behind them is Lieutenant Joe Kenda.
Hey, Skip. So what do we got? Richard Posey, age 29. He was shot 3 times, once in the neck. He's still alive, but it's not looking like he's gonna make it.
It's much easier to start off on a large scale with a homicide investigation and then scale it down if it ends up not being a homicide.
Smell that? He might have been hit 3 times, but there are a lot more shots fired than that.
And we still have the odor of gunpowder in the air.
I want you to stick around and see who we can talk to. I'm gonna head to the hospital, see if our victim's able to speak.
Yes, sir. Oh, while you're down there, maybe you can make contact with his brother. When officers arrived, he was standing over Mr. Posey. He rode down in the ambulance memorial with him.
Will do. Thanks.
the possibility does exist that Richard Posey is able to talk to us. Richard certainly saw the person that shot him and certainly knew why he was shot.
I'm looking for Richard Posey, the gunshot victim.
Yeah, the doctor's room with him now. Should be about another 15 minutes, but his brother's actually just up back there.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Are you Richard Posey's brother?
Yeah.
I'm Lieutenant Kenda.
Rodney came.
And I rode with him in the ambulance, and to hear him, you know, don't let me die. You know, I got too much to live for. I told him, you know, God got you. We're gonna, you know, you're gonna be all right. And I'll be honest, I didn't know if he was gonna be all right.
I understand how difficult this is, but we're just trying to find out who did this to your brother. Let's start at the beginning.
Richard just got back to the Springs, and we were throwing him a little party to welcome him.
He wanted to move his family back here and raise his family in Colorado Springs. And so we were throwing a barbecue. We had family and friends. A lot of us was there.
Everybody was having a good time, people in and out.
Yeah, I'm gonna go check out and see what's going on outside real quick. I'll be right back. All right.
You know, he was out on the front stoop for a little bit.
Given the time of the year of this party, it would be perfectly logical for people to sort of come and go in and out of the residence.
Is that when the shooting happened?
Nah, I saw Richard come back inside for a little while. It looked like something really bothered him. Seriously, you think you're... What's up, Rich? Yo, what's up, man? You good?
Don't worry, bro. I'm good. I'm good.
You don't look so good, man. You need to relax. Yo, you want another beer?
I said I'm good.
Okay, all right, my bad. Yo, well, you want a beer then? All right, ladies, drinks?
So Richard walked out of the apartment. The next thing Rodney heard was gunshots in the parking lot.
Rich! Rich, hang in there, man. Hang in there. What you doing with me? What you doing? Call the doctor, somebody.
I was just scared to death. I just thought that, you know, I was gonna lose my brother. I wanted to protect my big brother, Richard, like he protected me my whole life.
The guy with the gun ran right past me. But I was just focused on getting to my brother, and then he was gone. I heard him say to his friends, I hope I killed him. Call help, get help!
So there are important pieces that Rodney does tell us. We know that our victim, Richard, is upset about something when he comes in the apartment. We also know that the black male in his 20s who flees the area in a black car is likely the person responsible for the shooting.
Excuse me, Lieutenant. The doctor said you can meet with him now.
Okay. We'll keep you updated as this progresses. I'm going to see if your brother saw anything that can help us.
We did receive permission from the doctors to talk to him, although it had to be very brief.
Mr. Posey, I know you're in a lot of pain right now, but I was hoping you had the energy to talk to me for a minute.
Okay.
Do you know who shot you?
No. I just moved here. I don't know his name, but I think my cousin does.
So our victim says that his cousin Dana was in an argument with an unknown person he'd never seen before, and that this person is the one who shot him.
Richard, you know, coming to the defense of his cousin Dana, and that's where the trouble started.
Went inside. I came back out to see if he was gone. He just started shooting.
Lieutenant, it's time.
Okay. Mr. Posey, I'm going to let you rest. If you can think of any further description, have your family reach out to me. I hope you have a full recovery.
Was Dana dating the guy that she was arguing with? Did they have some sort of relationship? Had there been a bad breakup? You know, what exactly led to this argument?
Well, that obviously says that cousin Dana needs to be talked to immediately to find out if she knows who this person was.
Dana Shaw?
Yes.
Could you excuse us for a moment? Yeah, I just got back from the hospital, and Richard said you might be acquaintances with the man that shot him.
Me? No, I've never seen these guys a day in my life.
Dana tells us that she was out front where the party was going on, and she saw a group of people sort of lingering around.
One of those people steps forward and offers her drugs as a way of introduction.
I told him we didn't partake in that and to get out of here.
You didn't know any of them?
Well, none of the guys. The girl that they were with, she was familiar. I recognized her from around the neighborhood. She's a dealer. Cheryl Stewart.
Thank you.
So now we have a possible source for the identity of our shooter. Whoever Cheryl Stewart is next on our list.
Kenda and Arms mine their files for the name Cheryl Stewart. If she's a dealer, as Dana Shaw suggested, then she's likely to have a record.
Bingo.
You got something?
What I have is an arrest warrant for a Shirley Ann Stewart. Wanted for the distribution of narcotics. Shirley Ann / Cheryl. It's her AKA, but close enough.
Yes, yeah. Okay, let's send a couple uniforms to her last known address.
Got it.
Acting on her outstanding warrant, CSPD officers scoop up Shirley Ann Stewart, aka Cheryl, and deliver her to Kenda's interrogation room.
Look, I told them I didn't sell any drugs.
I don't care about your drug bust.
Then what am I doing here?
We have information that you were a witness or possibly an accomplice to a shooting yesterday. That is what you're doing here.
And you're going to tell us what you know.
And why would I do that?
When we have the leverage because of an arrest warrant, oftentimes we can essentially convince them that it's in their best interest to share information for us, and perhaps we can provide some assistance in dealing with the arrest warrant.
So you can make that go away?
Well, I'm a homicide detective, not the district attorney. But let's just say I know the district attorney.
Okay. He popped that guy. I was there.
And who's he?
Lorenzo. He's my boyfriend.
She immediately says, well, hey, I just started dating him. He is my boyfriend. His name is Lorenzo. He also goes by the name Lo, an abbreviation of Lorenzo. She doesn't know his last name.
You don't know his last name, and he's your boyfriend.
Look, I told you, we just started up.
And that's not too hard to believe. It's a very casual involvement in everyone.
Anyways, he's gone. You're not gonna find him.
He fled town. He's gone. He's not here anymore. He's not here and he's not coming back. That's what she says.
Well, where did he go?
He said he was going home.
Shirley shared with us that Lorenzo was from Oklahoma, Tulsa area, and she believes that is where he went to avoid being picked up here in Colorado Springs.
It's okay, Lorenzo, you can run, but you're not going to be able to hide for very long because we're going to hunt you down in Oklahoma and you're going to have to answer for this. We're investigating the shooting of Richard Posey. The investigation has revealed that the person responsible for this is known only as Lorenzo or Lo, and further that he has fled the jurisdiction on his way to Oklahoma.
Kenda sends Lorenzo's girlfriend Shirley to meet with a resident sketch artist to create a composite image of Lorenzo.
No, his mustache is a little fuller.
Okay, more like that?
Yes, that's him. That's Lorenzo.
Are you positive that's a strong resemblance?
Resemblance? It looks just like a picture of him.
I'll go ahead and fax that to the Tulsa authorities.
Yes, sir.
So that's it? Can I go home now?
Like I explained, I'm not the district attorney.
There's no break. There's none of that. Don't be a criminal. That's your break. We've given you usable advice for your future. But for right now, you're going to jail to face charges that you already obtained before we got interested in you.
It's Kenda.
Hello, Lieutenant. I'm calling from Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. Hey, we got that fax that you sent over and several of my detectives took a look at it.
Can you help ID him?
Sure can, but y'all have his alias. His real name is Arthur, it's not Lorenzo.
In their opinion, that composite is a clear image of Arthur Williams Jr., but he has a number of aliases to include Lorenzo and Lowe.
That's fantastic. Do you think you can locate him?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we can locate him for you.
Am I missing something?
Yeah, he's in our county jail.
Excuse me? He got arrested 2 days after he arrived in Oklahoma for attempted robbery, and he's in custody.
I think God just decided, okay, he's not going to get away with it. Don't worry about it. So I'm real thankful.
Kenda has Arthur Williams Jr. extradited and brought to CSPD headquarters.
They will conduct a small hearing in front of a judge. Most waive their right to extradition hearings and say, yeah, I'll go back, because it's going to happen anyway, whether they want it to or not.
Arthur, I'm Lieutenant Kenda, this is Detective Arms.
Showed you ain't got nothing on me. You don't even know my real name.
Oh, yeah? Well, why don't you inform us?
Larry Williams. I just go by Arthur Lorenzo sometimes.
So who knows who he truly is? Maybe he doesn't know either.
Well, whoever you are, I know you're the person that tried to kill Richard Posey. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, that dude was trying to kill me.
Oh, really?
He told investigators Richard went back into the house to get a gun. So Larry said he needed to get a gun, which he did. And then when Richard came back out, he claims that Richard had a gun. And so at that point, Larry shoots him in self-defense.
He said he went inside to obviously get a gun. What's so obvious about him going inside? He lives there.
Larry or Arthur, whatever your name is, I'm done with you. I've got enough to send you away for a long time. And you better pray for Mr. Posey.
Why should I be praying for that dude?
Because if he dies, you're gonna spend the rest of your life in prison. Get him out of my face.
Get up. Put your hands behind your back.
Larry Williams, a.k.a. Arthur, a.k.a. Lorenzo, is taken to jail to await indictment on criminal charges, which thankfully for Richard Posey only rise to the level of attempted homicide.
Miss Kenda, you're kidding. He's gonna make it?
Richard Posey is alive by mere chance because Williams had a design to kill him.
My brother, Rodney, he was there. And yeah, I really appreciated that my brother was there, to hold me down. So I believe that God had me all the time. So I give the praises to him. My brother comes second, and he understands that just as well as I do.
At that time, it was a very sad and scary time for us, but now we've moved on and, but he's here. He's here, he's alive.
With the ballistics results and Richard's testimony, the full story becomes clear.
A toast to my big bro. Finally back in the Springs, where he belongs. Let's turn it up one time.
I remember that day just like yesterday. Well, listen, everybody was drinking that night.
Yo, can we get in your party?
Nah, family only.
Oh, yeah? Well, how about we start a little party of our own then?
Some uninvited guest shows up, one of whom is Larry Williams.
Nah, we good. We don't do that over here.
All right, look, I make serious money off of this. You sure you don't smoke rock? You look kind of high right now.
Whores and bitches make money too. Which one are you? Seem like a broke-ass bitch to me.
She basically put this guy down, and embarrassed him a little bit.
Look, who you calling a bitch, bitch?
Whoa, ho. Can I help you?
Mind your own business, man. I'm talking to this bitch right here.
I'm her older cousin. I couldn't stand there to let some man disrespect her. We all grew up together. So she was like a sister to me.
Look, this is a family affair. I don't know why you're going around calling people names.
Man, get out of my face, man.
Look, I got a better idea. Why don't you and your little posse get the hell out of here before you say something you regret?
I said it kind of harsh to him. You don't be talking to my cousin like that, so that could trigger him off too,
Seriously, you think what's up, Rich? Yo.
Richard comes in the door and he's very distressed. Williams goes to his car and gets a weapon. Posey collapses face first in the parking lot. Williams walks up to him and shoots him in the back while he's on the ground. Williams then runs, jumps in a car, and drives out of the area and out of the state to avoid arrest.
Rich, hang in there, dog.
I still got bullets, and the older I get, the more pain I'm having and everything. You know, my life is it's just not the same.
Larry Williams is tried and convicted of first-degree assault and is sentenced to 10 years in the state penitentiary. Though Williams's actions almost cost Richard Posey his life, Richard derives no joy from the case's final outcome.
So I feel sorry for Larry Williams. I feel sorry because of his mother, his sister, his father, because they getting ready to lose somebody for some years.
Richard didn't do anything to deserve what happened to him. He just simply came out and said, "Leave my cousin alone."
How insane is that? That someone resorts to violence over words. Unfortunately, on the street, you encounter that routinely, a pathetic feature of human behavior.
It begins with a sound that never made it into the police report. Not a scream, not a gunshot, just the hum of a refrigerator in a narrow New York apartment, still running hours after its owner was last seen alive. On a cold March night in 1991, the city kept moving. Taxis splashed through slush. Neon signs flickered. A late train rattled under the streets of Queens. And inside a third-floor walk-up on 34th Avenue, a life quietly slipped out of alignment with the world. Her name was Eleanor Weiss, 34 years old. A legal secretary. No criminal record. No known enemies. The kind of person who paid rent on time and returned library books early. The kind of disappearance no one expects, until it happens. The last confirmed sighting came at 9:42 p.m. A neighbor saw her struggling with grocery bags at the building entrance. She smiled. She nodded. She went upstairs. She never came back down. By morning, Eleanor didn't show up for work. That alone was enough to trigger concern. She had never missed a day without calling. By noon, her sister was dialing the police. By evening, the apartment door was forced open. Nothing looked broken. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked like a crime. Her purse was on the kitchen chair. Wallet inside. Cash untouched. Her coat hung by the door, damp from melting snow. The groceries were half unpacked, milk souring on the counter, frozen peas thawed into a green puddle. The stove was off. The lights were on. The refrigerator kept humming, steady and indifferent. There was no blood, no note, no sign of struggle. And yet, Eleanor Weiss was gone. The first officers on scene used the word voluntary. Adults disappear all the time, they said. Just new relationships. Sudden decisions. But the family pushed back immediately. Eleanor had plans. A dentist appointment. A birthday dinner scheduled for Sunday. A voicemail left that morning saying, "I'll call you later, okay?" That voicemail would be replayed hundreds of times over the next 3 decades. Detectives canvassed the building. Tenants reported nothing unusual. No shouting. No arguments. No strange visitors. One neighbor mentioned hearing footsteps late at night. But in New York, footsteps mean nothing. They bleed into the background like traffic noise. By day 3, the story hit the local papers. Legal secretary missing in Queens. By day 7, the language hardened. Mysterious disappearance baffles police. By day 14, the phrase appeared for the first time. Cold case. Search teams combed nearby parks. Dogs followed Eleanor's scent down the stairwell, across the sidewalk, and lost it at the curb as if she had stepped into a waiting car or vanished into thin air. Her phone records showed no unusual calls. No threats. No secret numbers. Bank accounts untouched. Passports still in the apartment. No withdrawals. No movement. It was as if Eleanor had been erased between the front door and the hallway. Then came the first strange detail, small, easy to miss, but impossible to forget once noticed. A photograph on the living room shelf had been turned face down. Not removed. Not broken. Just flipped. It showed Eleanor as a child, standing between her parents, smiling stiffly at the camera. Detectives asked the sister if that meant anything. She said no. Probably nothing. Just an accident. But nothing else in the apartment had been disturbed. As the weeks passed, the investigation slowed. Tips dried up. Leads collapsed. The file grew thicker, but the answers didn't. Eleanor's face faded from the news cycle, replaced by the next tragedy, the next headline. The family didn't fade. Her mother kept the phone line active for years, paying the bill just in case. Her sister refused to move Eleanor's belongings, preserving the apartment like a museum of unanswered questions. Holidays came and went with an empty chair at the table. And somewhere deep inside the NYPD archives, a folder labeled Weiss, Eleanor, missing, 1991 was quietly stamped with two words that still echo like a verdict. Unresolved. Cold case. What no one realized then, not the police, not the media, not even the family, was that the truth had never left the apartment. It had just learned how to stay silent. The apartment stayed sealed for 48 hours after the initial search, police tape sagging across the door like a tired warning, and when detectives returned with fresh eyes, the city outside had already decided to forget, but inside, the silence had begun to feel deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see how much the investigators would miss this time. They moved slower now, touching nothing without gloves, photographing angles that had seemed meaningless days earlier, measuring distances between objects that hadn't moved an inch, and that was when the second detail surfaced, quieter than the first, easier to dismiss, but sharper once it lodged in the mind. The bedroom window was unlocked, not forced, not damaged, just unlatched, opening onto a narrow fire escape slick with old rust and last night's snowmelt, a possible exit that no one had mentioned before because no one had thought to look, because Eleanor Weiss was not the kind of woman who climbed fire escapes in the middle of the night. They checked it anyway. No fingerprints. No fibers. No footprints that survived the weather. The fire escape dropped 3 floors to an alley cluttered with trash bins and graffiti, a place where footsteps disappeared into concrete and noise swallowed everything else. A neighbor across the way remembered seeing someone on the fire escape once, weeks earlier, maybe months, maybe not at all, the memory already blurring under the pressure of police questions, and when asked to describe the figure, the neighbor shrugged, embarrassed, apologetic, saying only that it was dark, and people went out on fire escapes all the time to smoke. Back inside, detectives turned to Eleanor's personal life, and for the first time, the case shifted from absence to implication. Her desk at work revealed a routine existence, neat stacks of files, a calendar filled with mundane reminders, but tucked between 2 folders was a handwritten note with no date, no signature, just 4 words written hard enough to dent the paper. You promised never. No context. No explanation. When asked about it, coworkers shook their heads. No one recognized the handwriting. No one remembered a conversation that fit. Family interviews followed, and the tone changed immediately. Eleanor's sister, Ruth, was cooperative, precise, her answers clipped and careful, as if she had rehearsed them long before the police ever knocked. She spoke of a quiet childhood, strict parents, a house where emotions were kept behind closed doors and discipline was not discussed, only enforced. Their father had died years earlier, a heart attack, sudden, clean, leaving behind a reputation as a hard man but a good provider. Their mother, Miriam, sat through her interview with her hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor, offering little beyond bare facts, correcting her daughter once over the spelling of a childhood friend's name, then apologizing for the interruption, her voice barely audible. Detectives left with the sense that something was missing, not information exactly, but texture, the warmth or anger that usually leaked out when families were pushed hard enough. This family did not leak. They sealed. As weeks turned into months, Eleanor's disappearance hardened into routine paperwork, but a single call jolted the case back to life late one Friday night when a patrol officer reported a woman matching Eleanor's description seen near Port Authority, disoriented, possibly homeless. Detectives arrived to find a stranger instead, younger, frightened, and very much alive, the the resemblance evaporating under fluorescent lights, and the false hope collapsed just as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind only the familiar ache of almost. The media followed the pattern. A short resurgence. Then silence. The phrase cold case began to stick, appearing in smaller print, then not at all, and the Weiss family learned what it meant to grieve without proof, to mourn someone who might still be walking the same streets, just out of reach, just beyond recognition. Years passed, and with them came the slow erosion of certainty. Ruth married, moved to Long Island, boxed up Eleanor's clothes but couldn't bring herself to donate them. Miriam aged visibly, her hair whitening, her posture folding inward, as if time itself were pressing down on her shoulders. Every anniversary brought reporters who asked the same questions, and every year the answers grew shorter. Then, in 1996, 5 years after Eleanor vanished, a maintenance worker renovating a building 3 blocks from her apartment found something wedged behind a loose basement wall. A woman's scarf, red wool, frayed at the ends, knotted tightly around itself. It matched a description from Eleanor's sister, a gift from a winter trip years earlier, and for a moment, the case surged back into motion. The scarf went to the lab. Fibers were analyzed. No blood. No DNA that could survive scrutiny. It could not be conclusively linked to Eleanor, and just like that, the momentum died again, strangled by uncertainty. Detectives rotated out. Files were transferred. Handwriting on reports changed. The case numbers stayed the same. By the early 2000s, Eleanor Weiss had become a footnote in NYPD statistics, one of hundreds of unresolved disappearances from the early 90s, a time before ubiquitous cameras, before digital footprints, before cell phones betrayed every movement. And yet, one detective, nearing retirement, kept the file on his shelf, not because it haunted him, but because it annoyed him. Nothing fit. Not the voluntary disappearance. Not the lack of evidence. Not the family dynamics that felt rehearsed but never cracked. He reread the original reports one last time before clearing his desk and noticed something no one else had written down, something so small it had been overlooked for over a decade. The grocery receipt. It listed items purchased at 9:18 p.m. milk, bread, frozen vegetables, and one other thing, disposable plastic gloves. The kind sold in small boxes near the cleaning supplies. The kind you don't usually buy unless you need them for a specific reason. When asked years earlier, the cashier had mentioned them offhandedly, saying Eleanor joked about cleaning being a mess, but the detective wondered why that detail had never gone anywhere, why no one had asked what she planned to clean at nearly 10 o'clock at night, why the gloves were never found in the apartment. He flagged it, added a note, and then retired. The file went back to storage. Time did what time always does. It softened faces in photographs. It blurred memories until they became stories told the same way every time. But secrets age differently. They don't fade. They ferment. They wait. In 2021, a young investigator reopening cold cases stumbled onto Eleanor Weiss while cross-referencing unsolved disappearances with new forensic databases. At first, it was just another name, another file scanned into a system hungry for patterns, but as she read, something tightened in her chest, a familiar sensation she had learned to trust. The untouched apartment. The flipped photograph. The gloves. The family interviews that said everything and nothing at the same time. She requested the original tapes. She listened to Miriam Weiss's voice again, slowed down, enhanced, stripped of background noise, and in one moment, barely audible beneath the hum of the recording equipment, she heard something that had never made it into the transcript. A pause, too long, followed by a whisper that sounded less like confusion and more like correction, a word spoken under her breath when asked about Eleanor's childhood. We protected her. Not loved. Not raised. Protected. The investigator leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of 3 decades shift slightly, just enough to suggest that the truth, whatever it was, had never been buried. It had been kept. The phrase stayed with her long after the audio stopped playing, looping in the quiet of the office like a line from a confession no one realized they were giving. We protected her, not past tense, not finished, but ongoing, as if Eleanor Weiss were still a liability, still something fragile and dangerous at the same time, and the investigator felt that familiar tightening again, the instinct that told her this case had never been about disappearance, it had always been about containment. She pulled every supplemental report tied to the family, old welfare checks, school records, employment forms, anything that predated 1991, and patterns began to surface slowly, reluctantly, like shapes emerging through fog. Eleanor had changed schools twice before high school, not for academic reasons, but for family relocation, a phrase used too neatly, too often, in districts barely miles apart. A guidance counselor's note from 1983 mentioned extended absences, vague illnesses, stress-related fatigue, nothing actionable, nothing that triggered intervention in an era that preferred not to look too closely. Hospital records were sparse, but there was one visit, age 16, listed as a fall downstairs, no witnesses, minor injuries, discharged same day, and the investigator noted the symmetry immediately, the same explanation families offered when they wanted questions to stop. She requested sealed records. It took weeks. Paperwork crawled through departments that barely remembered why those files existed, but when they arrived, the tone shifted again, not with a single revelation, but with accumulation. Eleanor had once spoken to a school social worker, just once, and the transcript was thin, cautious, full of ellipses and redactions, but one sentence stood out, preserved like a fossil. She reports feeling responsible for maintaining peace at home. The investigator closed the file and stared at the ceiling, understanding that responsibility, recognizing it, because people who grow up like that don't vanish on impulse, they endure until something breaks. She returned to the apartment photos, now digitized, magnified beyond what 1991 technology allowed, and she lingered on the flipped photograph again, not as a symbol, but as an action, deliberate and restrained, someone choosing not to destroy, not to remove, just to deny the image its power, and she wondered who would do that and why. The gloves resurfaced in her mind, the missing gloves, and suddenly the groceries didn't look mundane anymore, they looked preparatory. She tracked down Ruth Weiss, now in her late 50s, living in a quiet cul-de-sac where neighbors waved and lawns were trimmed on schedule, and when the investigator introduced herself, Ruth smiled with practiced politeness, the kind that lived on the surface, not reaching the eyes. The interview took place at a kitchen table far cleaner than it needed to be, and Ruth answered questions the same way she always had, precise, efficient, emotionally neutral, until the investigator mentioned the audio, the whispered phrase, and for the first time, Ruth's hands stopped moving. "We protected her," Ruth repeated, testing the words, as if hearing them spoken aloud changed their shape, and then she laughed softly, too softly, and said families protect each other all the time, don't they? And the investigator didn't argue, she let the silence stretch instead, because silence was where this family revealed the most. When Ruth finally spoke again, it wasn't to clarify, it was to deflect, shifting the conversation back to police incompetence, to the years of nothing, to how cruel it was to reopen wounds after so long. The investigator left with nothing admissible and everything she needed. Next came Miriam Weiss, now living in assisted care, her memory officially unreliable, her body fragile enough to discourage aggressive questioning, but the investigator approached gently, not as law enforcement, but as a listener, and something about that posture loosened Miriam's grip on the present. She spoke in fragments, circling memories without landing on them, but when Eleanor's name came up, her voice sharpened unexpectedly. "She was strong," Miriam said. "Too strong." He hated that. The investigator didn't interrupt. She didn't ask who. She waited. Miriam frowned, confused, then waved her hand as if brushing away a fly. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "It's over." But it wasn't. The investigator left and immediately pulled the death certificate for the father, Jacob Weiss. Heart attack. Natural causes. No autopsy. Death at home, late evening, 1989. 2 years before Eleanor vanished. A detail that suddenly mattered more than it ever had. If Jacob was the center of whatever the family had been protecting Eleanor from, his absence should have been a relief, a release, not a prelude to disappearance. Unless the protection had failed long before he died. The investigator returned to the file and noticed another omission, something that hadn't registered before because no one thought to look for it. Eleanor's romantic life. No long-term partners. No exes interviewed. No jealous lovers ruled out. The reports simply noted no known significant relationships and moved on, as if that were unremarkable, but the investigator knew better. People with carefully managed childhoods often kept their adult lives small, controlled, quiet, minimizing exposure, minimizing risk. Then she found the letter. It had been misfiled, scanned into the system without proper tagging, a single-page handwritten note submitted anonymously in 1992 and dismissed as a prank. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written in haste or fear, and the message was short, cryptic, devastating in hindsight. She didn't leave. She was never allowed to. No signature. No return address. No follow-up. At the time, detectives had labeled it unsubstantiated and moved on. Now, 30 years later, it read like an accusation. The investigator cross-referenced the postmark. It came from a mailbox less than a mile from the Weiss apartment. She drove there herself, standing on the sidewalk, imagining the person who had dropped it in, heart racing, deciding whether to turn back, whether to speak, whether to disappear along with the truth. And that was when the realization hit her, sharp and unwelcome. This case wasn't cold because no one cared. It was cold because too many people had cared quietly, privately, without ever stepping forward, because whatever happened to Eleanor Weiss had unfolded behind doors that stayed closed, within a family that had learned early how to survive scrutiny. The investigator returned to her office and wrote a single line across the top of the reopened case file, not a conclusion, not a theory, but a reframing that changed everything. If this was never a missing person case, then the question was no longer where Eleanor Weiss went, but what happened to her when leaving was no longer an option, and the investigator felt the shift immediately, the way a room feels different once you realize the door has been locked from the inside. She rebuilt the timeline from the ground up, discarding assumptions that had calcified into fact, and focused instead on the final 48 hours, the narrow window where routine cracked and something irreversible took its place. Eleanor left work at 6:11 p.m. on the night she vanished. Security logs confirmed it, a detail overlooked for years because it was unremarkable, but now the investigator mapped every minute that followed, every gap where another presence could have entered without raising alarms. She stopped at the grocery store at 9:18 p.m., bought the items that would later be photographed and cataloged, including the gloves, and paid in cash, unusual for her, but not unheard of, and then she walked home, the receipt timestamp narrowing the margin for error until the night became claustrophobic, compressed, unforgiving. The unlocked window came back into focus, not as an exit, but as an expectation, something left ready, something prepared, and the investigator wondered who knew Eleanor's habits well enough to anticipate that detail, who knew which latch stuck, which hinge squeaked, who had stood in that bedroom before and memorized the geometry. Fire escapes were public in theory, private in practice, used by those who didn't want to be seen entering through the front door, and suddenly the lack of forced entry stopped being puzzling and started being obvious. She pulled phone records again, this time not just Eleanor's, but Ruth's, Miriam's, and Jacob's in the months leading up to his death, and patterns emerged where there had once been noise. Calls clustered late at night. Repetitive. Conversations that stopped abruptly, as if someone had entered the room. There were no recordings, just timestamps, but they told a story of coordination, not chaos. The investigator returned to the maintenance worker's scarf, the red wool that had briefly reignited hope years earlier, and she drove to the building where it had been found, walking the basement herself, measuring distances, noting how easy it would be to tuck something into a gap and forget it there, or leave it there intentionally, a breadcrumb that said enough without saying everything. The scarf didn't prove death, but it proved proximity, and proximity had always been the missing piece. She requested permission to exhume Jacob Weiss's body. The request was denied. No probable cause, the department said. No new evidence. No justification to disturb the dead after so long. The investigator argued that unresolved trauma didn't respect burial timelines, that secrets buried with bodies didn't stay buried forever, but procedure one, as it often did, and the father remained untouched, a closed chapter no one wanted to reopen. So she turned to the living. Ruth was brought in again, this time under the pretense of updating records, and the investigator watched her closely, noting how she corrected dates reflexively, how she remembered small details with surgical clarity and blanked on larger ones, how her composure faltered only when the conversation drifted toward the night of Jacob's death. Ruth described finding him on the living room floor, paramedics too late, a tragedy, sudden, unfair, and yet her voice flattened as she spoke, the emotion contained, managed, controlled. "What did Eleanor do that night?" the investigator asked. Ruth hesitated just a fraction too long. "She was asleep," Ruth said. "She didn't see anything." The investigator didn't challenge it. She didn't need to. The lie sat there on the table between them, heavy and obvious, because Eleanor had not lived at home in 1989. She had moved out years earlier. She could not have been asleep in that house. Ruth realized the mistake as soon as the words left her mouth, her jaw tightening, her eyes flicking away, the mask slipping for the briefest moment. It was enough. The investigator left the room knowing two things with absolute certainty. 1. Ruth had been present for more than one ending. 2. Eleanor's disappearance had not been an isolated event, but the final act in a story that had already claimed at least one life. The focus shifted again, away from a single night in 1991 and toward a family system that had learned how to absorb violence without leaving marks. The investigator found neighbors from Eleanor's childhood, now elderly, now freer with their memories, and they spoke of arguments behind closed doors, of the father's temper, of a girl who walked with her shoulders tense, who flinched at raised voices, who apologized too often for things that weren't her fault. One neighbor remembered an ambulance years before the reported heart attack, parked outside the Weiss home late at night, lights off, no sirens. The call had been logged as a medical emergency, resolved quickly, no transport. No one had asked questions. The investigator requested that report too. It was missing. By the time she returned to the office, the shape of the truth had begun to solidify, not as a clean narrative, but as a pressure, a sense that the cold case was not cold at all, it was compressed, dense, held together by fear and loyalty and the kind of silence that families mistake for love. Eleanor Weiss hadn't vanished because no one noticed. She had vanished because too many people noticed and decided that speaking would only make things worse. And now, 30 years later, the investigators stood at the edge of a revelation that threatened to collapse that silence entirely, knowing that once she stepped forward, there would be no way to contain what came next. The trouble with reopening a cold case like this was not the lack of evidence, it was the excess of it, fragments scattered across decades, each one harmless on its own, each one devastating when aligned, and the investigator felt the weight of that alignment pressing down as she began to reconstruct the night of March 12, 1991, not as a mystery, but as an inevitability. Eleanor Weiss didn't disappear into the city. The city closed around her while something smaller, more intimate, more controlled unfolded behind familiar walls. She started with the gloves. Disposable plastic. Unremarkable. The kind that left no trace if used correctly, the kind that suggested planning without drama, efficiency without spectacle. They were not in the apartment because they had done their job elsewhere, and once that possibility settled in, the rest followed with grim clarity. Someone Eleanor trusted had entered that apartment after she arrived home, not through the front door, not loudly, but through the window she left unlocked because she expected them, because expectation had been trained into her long before adulthood. Phone records placed Ruth Weiss within a 10-block radius that night, her landline logging a brief outgoing call at 10:03 p.m., duration 30 seconds, recipient unknown, the number no longer traceable, and the investigator knew better than to ignore a call that short. Those calls were not conversations. They were signals. Confirmation. Done. The investigator tracked down an old cab dispatcher who had worked nights in Queens in the early 90s, now retired, memory brittle but intact around certain routines, and when asked about pickups near 34th Avenue around that time, he remembered a request that had struck him as odd even then, a fare ordered to an alley instead of the curb, a woman helping another woman into the back seat, both quiet, both tense. He couldn't remember faces. He remembered posture. He remembered how one of them kept apologizing. There was no record of the ride. Cash fare. No receipt. No destination logged. That was how it was done back then. If you wanted to disappear someone, you didn't need sophistication. You needed timing. The investigator returned to Miriam Weiss, not for answers, but for reactions, and she spoke of Eleanor's strength again, of how hard it had been to keep the peace, of how Jacob had demanded loyalty above all else, and as Miriam spoke, the lines blurred between past and present, between justification and confession. She said families made sacrifices. She said some things couldn't be undone. She said Eleanor had always wanted to protect her sister. Protect. The word landed differently now. Eleanor hadn't been the one protected. She had been the one doing the protecting, absorbing blows, smoothing over chaos, becoming the buffer that kept the family intact until she couldn't anymore. The investigator realized then that Eleanor's greatest threat had never been leaving, it had been telling, and telling was something the family could not allow. The anonymous letter from 1992 came back into focus, the shaky handwriting, the simple assertion that Eleanor didn't leave, that she was never allowed to, and the investigator wondered if the writer had been someone close enough to see what was happening but too afraid to name names, someone who understood the cost of breaking silence and chose distance instead. Fear, after all, didn't expire with time. The investigator prepared a report, careful, restrained, built on inference rather than accusation, because that was all she had, and she knew the limitations of what could be proven versus what could be known. Without a body, without forensic confirmation, the case hovered in a liminal space where truth existed but justice did not. Then a call came in that shifted everything. A construction crew working on a derelict property in upstate New York had uncovered human remains during foundation work, incomplete, weathered, but recent enough to preserve certain markers, including fragments of fabric and a length of red wool tangled around bone. The location was remote, private land once owned by a shell company that traced back, after several dead ends, to a name the investigator recognized immediately: Jacob Weiss. He had purchased the land years before his death, a hunting retreat, rarely used, rarely discussed, a place that did not appear in family conversations or public records beyond a single transaction buried in tax filings. The investigator drove north herself, the road narrowing as the city fell away, the landscape opening into something quiet and unforgiving, and when she arrived, she stood at the edge of a shallow grave and felt the final piece slide into place. The remains were female. The estimated age range fit. The scarf was the same knit pattern Ruth had described decades earlier. There was no ID, no jewelry, no purse, just bones and fabric and the unmistakable sense of having been hidden, not lost. For the first time in 30 years, the case had weight, literal weight, something that could be measured, tested, confronted. But even then, as the investigator watched forensic teams work, she knew the hardest part was still ahead, because uncovering the truth was only the beginning. Explaining it to a system that demanded certainty, that required clear perpetrators and clean motives, was another matter entirely. The cold case was no longer cold. It was volatile. The discovery changed the temperature of everything, not with relief, not with triumph, but with a sudden, suffocating heat, because once a body exists, silence becomes dangerous, and everyone who has lived comfortably inside it feels the walls closing in. The remains were catalogued, bagged, transported under gray skies while state troopers kept the road clear, and the investigator watched from a distance, knowing that what lay in those evidence bags was not just proof of death, but proof of a decision made long ago, a decision that had been protected with the same discipline that once governed the Weiss household. Forensics worked methodically. The bones told their story slowly, reluctantly, fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, not immediately fatal, damage that suggested restraint rather than rage, control rather than chaos. There were no defensive wounds preserved clearly enough to testify, but there was enough to say this was not an accident, not exposure, not a fall. The red wool scarf was wrapped tight, not casually discarded, knotted with intention, and the investigator thought of the gloves again, the missing gloves, the clean apartment, the absence of blood where blood should have been. DNA confirmation took weeks, and during that time, the investigator returned to Queens, to the apartment building that had held its breath for 3 decades, and she walked the same stairs Eleanor had climbed for the last time, feeling the narrowness of the hallway, the way sound traveled, the way neighbors could hear everything and notice nothing. She stood outside the apartment door and imagined the moment of entry, the quiet knock, the familiar voice, the decision to open the window instead of the door, because old habits die hard, because secrecy had been taught as survival. When the DNA result came back, it was definitive. Eleanor Weiss. The missing woman was no longer missing. She had been found, belatedly, brutally, undeniably. The case shifted jurisdictions. State police took interest. Prosecutors asked questions with sharpened focus. And suddenly, the Weiss family was no longer a tragic footnote, but a potential crime scene that had been active for years without anyone realizing it. Ruth was contacted first, informed of the discovery, offered support, resources, condolences, and the investigator listened from another room as Ruth absorbed the news, her reaction muted, measured, grief performed rather than felt, until one phrase cut through the calm. "So you finally found her," Ruth said. "Finally. Not what happened. Not where was she. Finally." Miriam Weiss was next. Her reaction was different. She cried openly, her body shaking, repeating Eleanor's name like a prayer, but between the sobs, she whispered something that chilled the room, something she had whispered once before, years ago, when no one was listening closely enough. "We did what we had to do." The investigator felt the weight of it settle into her chest, the quiet horror of inevitability, because there it was, the justification that had carried this family through decades of silence, the belief that harm could be balanced, that one life could be traded to preserve another, that morality was flexible if you never spoke it aloud. Prosecutors pushed for charges. The evidence was circumstantial but converging. Land ownership, family access, witness recollections, phone records, behavioral patterns. It was enough to build a narrative, not enough to guarantee a conviction, and everyone in the room knew it. Without a confession, without a witness willing to break ranks, the case would hinge on persuading a jury to believe that a family could do this to its own, that protection could curdle into elimination. The investigator prepared for that possibility by going back to the beginning, to Eleanor herself, to who she had been before she became a case, before she became remains in a forest. She reread journals recovered from the apartment, pages once dismissed as mundane, now heavy with subtext, lines about keeping things together, about not making trouble, about promises made and kept at personal cost. There was no explicit fear written down, no accusation, but the absence spoke volumes. People who live in danger learn early how not to name it. One entry, dated just weeks before her disappearance, stood out at last, overlooked because it seemed hopeful at the time. "I think it's almost over," Eleanor had written. "I just have to get through one more thing." No explanation. No context. But now, it read like a countdown. The investigator wondered if Eleanor had planned to confront someone, to expose something, to end a cycle that had defined her life, and whether that intention had reached the wrong ears. Secrets like these had their own surveillance. They didn't need microphones or cameras. They traveled through tension, through tone, through the sudden quiet when a sentence went unfinished. As the case moved toward a grand jury, the investigator felt the strain deepen, not just professionally, but personally, because this was no longer about solving a mystery, it was about witnessing the aftermath of a long, slow violence that had been normalized through repetition. Eleanor Weiss had not been killed in a moment of madness. She had been removed in a moment of consensus. And consensus, she knew, was the hardest thing to prosecute. The grand jury convened under fluorescent lights that flattened everything they touched, emotion included, and the investigator watched as the story of Eleanor Weiss was reduced to exhibits, timelines, arrows on screens, the messy human gravity of it compressed into something orderly enough to argue over. This was where cold cases often stumbled, not because the truth was unclear, but because it was too complicated to fit inside the clean lines of legal logic, and the prosecutor knew it, choosing words carefully, framing each fact as part of a pattern rather than a leap. They began with the land. The upstate property, purchased quietly by Jacob Weiss years before his death, maintained through shell payments that continued long after he was gone, taxes paid on time, utilities minimal but present, a place kept alive without ever being lived in. The jury saw maps. Transfers. They heard how easy it would have been to access the site without neighbors, without witnesses, without anyone asking why a family needed a second place that no one talked about. Then came the remains. Not shown, but described with clinical restraint. Age range. Trauma indicators. The scarf. The knot. The way fabric told a story bones could only hint at. The prosecutor avoided theatrics. He didn't need them. The facts were heavy enough on their own. Ruth Weiss was called next. She walked into the room composed, dressed conservatively, hair pulled back tight, posture perfect, the image of a woman who had survived by mastering control. Her testimony followed the familiar script at first: grief, confusion, denial of knowledge, the insistence that Eleanor was loved, that the family had suffered deeply, that any suggestion otherwise was cruel. But under cross-examination, cracks appeared, hairline fractures that spread as the questions narrowed. She was asked about the night of March 12, 1991. About her whereabouts. About the call logged at 10:03. About the cab dispatcher's recollection. Ruth denied memory of the call. Denied taking a cab. Denied being near Eleanor's apartment. Her answers came quickly, too quickly, rehearsed to the point of rigidity, and the investigator watched jurors exchange glances, the subtle communication of doubt forming in real time. Then the prosecutor asked about the gloves. Disposable plastic gloves. Purchased by Eleanor hours before her disappearance. Not found in the apartment. Not accounted for. Ruth frowned, said she didn't know why Eleanor would buy them, suggested cleaning again, repeated the old explanation, and for a moment it almost worked, until the prosecutor asked a question so simple it landed like a blow. Did your sister clean often at 10 o'clock at night? Ruth hesitated. Just long enough. The room felt it. Miriam Weiss was not called. Her health had declined rapidly after the discovery of the remains, memory fractured, doctors advising against testimony, and in her absence, the family narrative lost its emotional anchor. Without her, there was no trembling matriarch to soften the edges, no visible grief to redirect sympathy. There was only Ruth, standing alone, defending decades of silence with words that sounded thinner each time they were repeated. The anonymous letter was introduced next. The jury heard its contents, the simple assertion, the absence of a name, the fear embedded in its brevity. Defense counsel argued it was hearsay, meaningless, the product of imagination or malice, but the investigator saw jurors lean forward as it was read, recognizing something universal in its tone, the voice of someone who knows too much and says too little. Outside the courtroom, the media revived the headline that had waited 30 years to exist. New York 1991 cold case solved, family secret exposed after 30 years. The phrase spread fast, ricocheting across screens, drawing in voices that had stayed quiet for decades, neighbors, former classmates, distant relatives, people who remembered things they hadn't trusted themselves to remember before. Tips flooded in, not all useful, but collectively damning, a chorus of hindsight that filled in emotional gaps the evidence could not. One call stood out. A woman in her 70s, voice shaking, said she had lived next door to the Weiss family in the 80s, said she had seen Eleanor on the fire escape late at night more than once, sitting with her knees drawn up, crying quietly, waiting for something to calm down inside the apartment. She said she had told herself it wasn't her business. She said she regretted that every day. The investigator listened, thanked her, hung up, and felt the familiar ache of too late. The grand jury deliberated for 3 days. When the decision came, it was partial, imperfect, but monumental. An indictment on charges related to concealment, abuse of a corpse, conspiracy. Not murder. Not yet. The evidence couldn't quite stretch that far without risking collapse. But it was enough to bring Ruth Weiss to trial, enough to force the family's silence into the open air. Ruth was arrested quietly. No handcuffs in public. No spectacle. She walked out of her home between officers, neighbors watching from behind curtains, the same way they had watched nothing all those years ago. As she was placed in the car, she looked back once, not at the house, not at the street, but at the sky, her expression unreadable, and the investigator wondered what she was calculating in that moment, what version of the story she was preparing to defend now that the old one no longer held. As the car pulled away, the investigator felt no satisfaction, only a deep, unsettling awareness that this case, even now, even with bones recovered and charges filed, was still unfinished, because the truth, the full truth, had lived too long inside a family to come out cleanly, and whatever happened next would demand a reckoning not just with what had been done, but with why so many people had let it happen. The cold case had cracked open. What spilled out was not closure. It was consequence. The trial began in a courtroom that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a place designed to strip stories down to their bones, and Ruth Weiss took her seat at the defense table like someone attending a long-scheduled appointment, calm, prepared, certain that control was still possible if she held the line long enough. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, the city leaned in, hungry not just for answers, but for absolution, for reassurance that this kind of thing did not happen quietly, did not happen without warning, did not happen inside ordinary families. The prosecution opened with restraint. No raised voices. No accusations sharpened for effect. Just a statement of fact delivered steadily, almost gently, as if speaking too loudly might fracture something already fragile. Eleanor Weiss, they said, did not disappear. She was taken. Her absence was not a mystery of chance, but the result of deliberate choices made by people who knew her best. The defense countered with doubt. Circumstantial. Speculation. Tragedy repackaged as guilt. They painted Ruth as a grieving sister targeted by a system desperate to close a headline-ready cold case. A woman punished for surviving, for being the last one standing. They reminded the jury that there were no eyewitnesses, no confession, no recorded admission, only interpretations layered on top of silence. The investigator watched from the gallery, knowing both sides were right in their own way, because this case lived in the narrow space between what could be proven and what could be felt, and juries were trained to distrust feelings. Witnesses came and went. The cab dispatcher testified, voice unsteady, memory imperfect but sincere, describing posture, tension, apology. The neighbors spoke about the fire escape, the crying, the regret. Experts explained trauma responses, family systems built around containment, the psychology of silence. Each piece landed softly on its own, but together they formed a weight that pressed against the room, an accumulation of almosts and maybes that pointed in one direction even as they refused to crystallize into certainty. Then the journals were introduced. Eleanor's handwriting appeared on the screen, loops and slants frozen in time, and as passages were read aloud, the courtroom shifted. This was no longer abstract. This was a voice reaching across decades, measured, careful, never accusatory, but unmistakably strained. Lines about keeping things together, about promises, about being tired of holding everything in place. The final entry drew a collective breath from the room. I think it's almost over. The defense objected to interpretation. The judge allowed the words to stand without commentary, and in that silence, the jury filled in the gaps themselves. Ruth took the stand on the fifth day. She spoke clearly, confidently. She denied involvement, denied knowledge, denied intent. She described Eleanor as fragile, prone to dramatizing, capable of leaving without explanation, and as she spoke, something subtle shifted, the portrayal of a sister transforming into something smaller, something easier to dismiss, and the investigator felt a familiar chill, recognizing the pattern, the reframing that made harm feel necessary, even kind. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor returned to the same points again and again, not aggressively, but persistently, the way water wears down stone. The gloves. The call. The property. The scarf. Ruth answered each question, but the answers grew thinner, more abstract, leaning on phrases like I don't recall and I can't say for sure, until finally, the prosecutor asked her about protection. You've used that word before, he said. Protected. What did your family need protection from? Ruth paused. The courtroom went very still. From what? She repeated, buying time, and then she smiled, just slightly, and said, from falling apart. The words hung there, incomplete, unsatisfying, and yet revealing, because falling apart implied pressure, strain, something pushing from the inside, and the prosecutor let the moment breathe, knowing it had done its work. Closing arguments came and went. The jury disappeared into deliberation. Days passed. The city speculated. Experts argued. Families watched. And Eleanor Weiss remained, as she always had, at the center of it all, present only through absence, through the void she had left behind. When the verdict came, it was mixed. Guilty on concealment. Guilty on conspiracy. Not guilty on the highest charge. A murmur rippled through the room, relief and disappointment colliding, and Ruth absorbed it without visible reaction, her face composed as ever, but her shoulders sagged just enough to suggest that control had finally cost her something. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. The legal process would grind on, indifferent to narrative satisfaction. But outside the courthouse, something had shifted permanently. The family secret was no longer sealed. It had been named, argued, dissected in public, and even without full justice, the silence had been broken. The investigators stood on the steps afterward, watching the crowd disperse, feeling no triumph, only a quiet exhaustion, because cold cases did not end cleanly, they unraveled, thread by thread, leaving frayed edges and unanswered questions in their wake. Eleanor Weiss had been found. But understanding her fate was proving far harder than proving her death. After the verdict, the city exhaled, not in relief, but in that uneasy way people do when a story ends without the ending they were promised, and the investigator felt it too, the hollow space where closure was supposed to live. The legal boxes had been checked, sentences drafted, appeals anticipated, but the truth still felt incomplete, like a confession interrupted mid-sentence. Cold cases, she knew, rarely delivered justice the way fiction did. They delivered something messy, acknowledgement. In the weeks that followed, letters began to arrive at the district attorney's office, handwritten, uneven, coming from people who had watched the trial and recognized themselves somewhere in it. Former neighbors. Estranged relatives. One came from a woman who had once shared a hospital room with Miriam Weiss in the late 80s, recovering from minor procedures, bonded briefly by proximity and boredom. She wrote about a night when Miriam had cried quietly, speaking to no one in particular, saying she was afraid of what her husband might do if the girl didn't stop pushing back. At the time, the woman had dismissed it as medication talking. Now, she wasn't so sure. The investigator logged the letter, added it to a file that would likely never see a courtroom, but mattered nonetheless, because each one chipped away at the illusion that this had been an isolated tragedy, an aberration rather than a pattern. Patterns were harder to prosecute, but impossible to unsee once recognized. Ruth Weiss was sentenced to a term that felt both heavy and insufficient, years measured against decades of silence, and as she was led away, she finally looked at Eleanor's photograph displayed at the front of the courtroom. It was the first time anyone could remember her doing so. Her expression did not soften. It did not harden either. It simply emptied, as if whatever calculation she had been running all her life had reached its conclusion. Miriam Weiss died 6 months later. The official cause was natural, complications of age and illness, and there was no investigation, no appetite for one, but among those who had followed the case closely, the timing felt significant, the final closing of a chapter that had stayed open too long. At her funeral, the service was small, controlled, attended by family and a few neighbors, and when the investigator stood at the back of the room, unseen, she listened as the priest spoke of forgiveness, of burdens carried in silence, of the grace of release. No one mentioned Eleanor by name. The apartment in Queens was sold. Renovated. The refrigerator replaced. The window repaired. New tenants moved in, unaware of the history soaked into the walls, living their lives unbothered by the past, because cities were good at that, at building over pain and calling it renewal. Only the investigator carried the full map now, the knowledge of what had happened and how long it had been allowed to happen. She returned to the upstate property one last time before it was reclaimed by the state, standing where the shallow grave had been, now filled, the earth indistinguishable from the rest of the clearing, and she thought about Eleanor's final days, about the moment she might have believed things could end differently, about the cost of that belief. Hope, the investigator understood, could be dangerous in the wrong environment. It could provoke as much as it promised. The case file was closed officially, stamped, archived, placed on a shelf alongside others that had once felt urgent, and the investigator wrote her final note in careful handwriting, not a conclusion, not an accusation, but an observation meant for whoever might open it next. Silence functioned as an accomplice. The phrase lingered in her mind as she left the building, stepping back into a city that had already moved on, because cities always did. They absorbed stories like this and metabolized them into cautionary tales, headlines, content, something consumed and then forgotten. But for those who had lived inside the story, forgetting was not an option. Some nights, the investigators still dreamed of the fire escape, of Eleanor sitting in the dark, knees pulled close, waiting for something to pass, waiting for quiet, and she wondered how many people had seen her and turned away, how many had told themselves it wasn't their place, how many had believed silence was safer. The cold case had been solved on paper. In reality, it remained unresolved in all the ways that mattered, a reminder that some crimes did not end with a verdict, but echoed forward, shaping lives, shaping choices, long after the headlines faded. Eleanor Weiss was no longer missing. She was a presence, a weight, a lesson that refused to disappear. Part 9. After the verdict, the city exhaled, not in relief, but in that uneasy way people do when a story ends without the ending they were promised, and the investigator felt it too, the hollow space where closure was supposed to live. The legal boxes had been checked, sentences drafted, appeals anticipated, but the truth still felt incomplete, like a confession interrupted mid-sentence. Cold cases, she knew, rarely delivered justice the way fiction did. They delivered something messy, acknowledgement. In the weeks that followed, letters began to arrive at the district attorney's office, handwritten, uneven, coming from people who had watched the trial and recognized themselves somewhere in it. Former neighbors. Estranged relatives. One came from a woman who had once shared a hospital room with Miriam Weiss in the late 80s, recovering from minor procedures, bonded briefly by proximity and boredom. She wrote about a night when Miriam had cried quietly, speaking to no one in particular, saying she was afraid of what her husband might do if the girl didn't stop pushing back. At the time, the woman had dismissed it as medication talking. Now, she wasn't so sure. The investigator logged the letter, added it to a file that would likely never see a courtroom, but mattered nonetheless, because each one chipped away at the illusion that this had been an isolated tragedy, an aberration rather than a pattern. Patterns were harder to prosecute, but impossible to unsee once recognized. Ruth Weiss was sentenced to a term that felt both heavy and insufficient, years measured against decades of silence, and as she was led away, she finally looked at Eleanor's photograph displayed at the front of the courtroom. It was the first time anyone could remember her doing so. Her expression did not soften. It did not harden either. It simply emptied, as if whatever calculation she had been running all her life had reached its conclusion. Miriam Weiss died 6 months later. The official cause was natural, complications of age and illness, and there was no investigation, no appetite for one, but among those who had followed the case closely, the timing felt significant, the final closing of a chapter that had stayed open too long. At her funeral, the service was small, controlled, attended by family and a few neighbors, and when the investigator stood at the back of the room, unseen, she listened as the priest spoke of forgiveness, of burdens carried in silence, of the grace of release. No one mentioned Eleanor by name. The apartment in Queens was sold, renovated, the refrigerator replaced, the window repaired. New tenants moved in, unaware of the history soaked into the walls, living their lives unbothered by the past, because cities were good at that, at building over pain and calling it renewal. Only the investigator carried the full map now, the knowledge of what had happened and how long it had been allowed to happen. She returned to the upstate property one last time before it was reclaimed by the state, standing where the shallow grave had been, now filled, the earth indistinguishable from the rest of the clearing, and she thought about Eleanor's final days, about the moment she might have believed things could end differently, about the cost of that belief. Hope, the investigator understood, could be dangerous in the wrong environment. It could provoke as much as it promised. The case file was closed officially, stamped, archived, placed on a shelf alongside others that had once felt urgent, and the investigator wrote her final note in careful handwriting, not a conclusion, not an accusation, but but an observation meant for whoever might open it next. Silence functioned as an accomplice. The phrase lingered in her mind as she left the building, stepping back into a city that had already moved on, because cities always did. They absorbed stories like this and metabolized them into cautionary tales, headlines, content, something consumed and then forgotten. But for those who had lived inside the story, forgetting was not an option. Some nights, the investigators still dreamed of the fire escape, of Eleanor sitting in the dark, knees pulled close, waiting for something to pass, waiting for quiet, and she wondered how many people had seen her and turned away, how many had told themselves it wasn't their place, how many had believed silence was safer. The cold case had been solved on paper. In reality, it remained unresolved in all the ways that mattered, a reminder that some crimes did not end with a verdict, but echoed forward, shaping lives, shaping choices, long after the headlines faded. Eleanor Weiss was no longer missing. She was a presence, a weight, a lesson that refused to disappear. Years later, long after the cameras had packed up and the headlines had sunk into archives and search results, the case of Eleanor Weiss resurfaced in quieter ways, the way unresolved truths always did, slipping back into conversation when no one expected them, reappearing in training rooms, in lectures, in the low voices of detectives who needed an example of how a cold case could thaw without ever fully healing. The investigator found herself speaking about it to recruits, not as a triumph, but as a warning, because this was not a story about clever breakthroughs or dramatic confessions. It was a story about time, and what time did to silence. She told them how easy it was to mistake absence for mystery, how comfortable it felt to label something a cold case and move on, and how dangerous that comfort could be. Eleanor Weiss had lived in plain sight, surrounded by people who saw enough to know something was wrong and not enough to feel responsible for intervening. That was how the crime survived for 30 years, not hidden, not buried, just unchallenged. Outside those rooms, the world continued to metabolize the story in fragments. Podcasts dissected it. Documentaries softened it. Comment sections argued over Ruth's guilt, Miriam's complicity, Jacob's shadow. Everyone wanted a villain they could recognize, someone safely distant, someone clearly monstrous. Few wanted to sit with the truth that this had been ordinary, procedural, executed without spectacle, sustained by routine and fear. The investigator received an email from a woman in her 40s who said she had been Eleanor's classmate in middle school, remembered her as quiet, helpful, always stepping between others and trouble. She wrote about a day when Eleanor had stayed late after class, cleaning chalkboards while the rest of them ran outside, and how, at the time, it had seemed generous, admirable even. Looking back now, she wondered if Eleanor had simply been practicing how to make herself useful enough to avoid consequences. The investigator replied with a brief note of thanks and closed the file again, feeling the familiar ache of recognition. In another part of the city, Ruth Weiss adjusted to incarceration with the same discipline she had applied to every other environment, following rules, avoiding conflict, becoming invisible when visibility no longer served her. She never spoke publicly about Eleanor. She never granted interviews. Those who interacted with her described her as polite, distant, meticulous. Control, it seemed, was still intact even here. The upstate property was eventually absorbed into public land, trails cut through what had once been isolation, hikers passing unknowingly over ground that had held a secret for decades. Nature did what it always did. It reclaimed. It covered. It erased the sharpest edges. Only the investigator knew exactly where to stand if she wanted to remember, and sometimes, on days when the weight felt heavier than usual, she drove there alone, stood quietly, and let the wind move through the trees without asking anything of it. What haunted her most was not the violence itself, but the economy of it. How little had been required. No elaborate plan. No dramatic confrontation. Just a decision made quietly, reinforced over time, protected by a shared understanding that survival justified everything. Eleanor Weiss had been eliminated not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to threaten a balance that depended on her silence. The investigator began to see echoes everywhere. In other files. In other families. In other cases where victims were described as difficult, dramatic, unstable, words that softened the ground before harm occurred. She pushed back where she could, challenged language, asked harder questions, knowing it would not be enough, knowing it never was, but also knowing that silence only needed a little resistance to start breaking down. Late one evening, long after she should have gone home, she reopened Eleanor's journal one final time, not searching for evidence, not looking for something new, but reading it the way it had always deserved to be read, as a record of endurance. She stopped at a passage she had skimmed over before, a line that now felt like a thesis rather than a footnote. If I stop holding this together, I don't know what will happen. The investigator closed the journal gently, understanding at last that Eleanor had not feared chaos for herself. She had feared what chaos would unleash in others, and that fear had cost her everything. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and alive, and the investigator turned off the light, carrying the case with her not as an open wound, but as a scar, a reminder etched deep enough to change how she moved through the world. The cold case had taught her something no manual ever could. Some crimes were not committed in darkness. They were committed in silence, in rooms where everyone knew the rules and no one dared to say them out loud. There was no ceremony when the case was finally archived for good, no announcement, no final headline to signal that the story of Eleanor Weiss had reached its end, because stories like this never ended. They simply receded, slipping beneath the surface of public attention while continuing to ripple outward in quieter, more permanent ways. The investigator signed the last document, closed the folder, and felt the strange resistance of it, as if the weight of 30 years did not want to be shelved, as if the paper itself understood that it was being asked to contain something that could not be contained. She thought about Eleanor often after that, not as a victim in the narrow sense, but as a presence that lingered just behind certain decisions, certain instincts, a name that surfaced whenever a case involved silence too neatly arranged, family narratives too carefully aligned. Eleanor became a reference point, a silent partner in the investigator's work, reminding her to listen not just to what was said, but to what was avoided, softened, or justified away. The city, meanwhile, moved on completely. New scandals replaced old ones. New tragedies demanded attention. The phrase cold case found new hosts, new victims, new mysteries to orbit. Eleanor's name still existed online, embedded in long-form articles and late-night videos, but for most people, she had become content, something consumed in an hour and forgotten by morning. That was the final indignity, perhaps, the way even the most intimate violence could be flattened into narrative, stripped of its human cost and repackaged as intrigue. On the anniversary of Eleanor's disappearance, years after the verdict, the investigator returned to Queens alone. The building was freshly painted, the hallway brighter, the door to the old apartment replaced, its lock modern, secure, anonymous. She stood there longer than necessary, imagining the hum of the refrigerator, the groceries on the counter, the moment before the knock or the whisper through the window, the moment when Eleanor might have still believed this was just another problem she could manage if she stayed calm enough. There was no memorial plaque, no marker, just an address. The investigator left a small bouquet on the sidewalk, not for anyone to see, but because some gestures didn't need witnesses to matter. As she walked away, she felt the familiar tension ease slightly, not because anything had been resolved, but because remembering was its own form of resistance, a refusal to let the story dissolve completely into abstraction. She understood now that Eleanor Weiss had not been silenced by a single act, but by a system of quiet agreements, reinforced over years, normalized through repetition, and protected by the belief that harm could be justified if it kept something worse at bay. That belief was the true crime, the engine that powered everything else, and it was far older than this one family, far more widespread than any courtroom could address. The investigator carried that understanding with her into every room after that, into interviews where words were chosen too carefully, into files where victims were described as problems, into moments where doing nothing felt easier than asking the question that might change everything. Eleanor's story sharpened those moments, made inaction feel heavier, less neutral, less excusable. Late one night, unable to sleep, the investigator found herself replaying the voicemail Eleanor had left for her sister the morning she disappeared, the one that had been archived and replayed so many times it had lost its immediacy. "I'll call you later, okay?" It was such a small sentence, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet it carried the entire tragedy inside it, the assumption of time, of continuity, of a future that would arrive as expected. Later never came. That, the investigator realized, was the most honest ending this story could offer. Not justice. Not closure. Just the stark recognition of what was taken, and how quietly it happened. Eleanor Weiss did not vanish. She was erased by people who believed they were preserving something more important than her life, and by a world that looked away long enough for that belief to harden into fact. The cold case had been labeled solved, but the lesson it carried remained dangerously unresolved, echoing wherever silence was mistaken for peace and endurance was mistaken for consent. And somewhere in the city, beneath the noise and the lights, beneath the routines that made everything feel normal again, that lesson waited, patient and unresolved, for the next time someone chose not to ask what was really happening behind a closed door. The file stayed closed, but the case did not. It lingered in places that were never meant to hold evidence, in late conversations between detectives who had never worked it but felt as though they had, in classrooms where criminology students dissected it like a specimen, confident they would have seen what everyone else missed, and in the quiet moments before sleep when the city softened and questions resurfaced without warning. Eleanor Weiss became one of those names that refused to sit still, a ghost threaded into the collective memory, resurfacing whenever someone asked how a person could disappear in plain sight, surrounded by people who claimed to love her. Years later, a journalist tried to track down the remaining members of the family. Doors closed gently but firmly. Phones rang unanswered. One cousin agreed to speak on background, voice tight, every sentence shaped to avoid blame. It was complicated, she said, a phrase worn smooth by decades of use, a phrase that explained everything and nothing at once. Complicated became the final shield, a way to acknowledge darkness without stepping fully into it. In the old neighborhood, residents still remembered the night Eleanor vanished, even if the details had blurred. They remembered the sirens, the patrol cars, the way the block seemed to hold its breath for weeks afterward. One woman recalled standing at her window, watching officers carry boxes down the stairs, and thinking how strange it was that a life could be packed into cardboard so quickly. Another remembered the rumors, how they shifted with the years, how the truth always seemed just out of reach, like a headline cut off mid-sentence. Cold case. The words never quite fit. Cold suggested distance, detachment, something left behind by time, but this case had never cooled. It had simply been buried under layers of normalcy, under routines that resumed because they had to, under a city that specialized in forgetting just enough to keep moving. The investigator understood that better than most. She had seen how unresolved violence seeped into unrelated moments, how it bent perceptions, made people quicker to doubt, slower to trust. Eleanor's absence had shaped decisions she would never know about, altered paths she would never walk. That was the quiet damage no verdict could measure. Sometimes, the investigator imagined an alternate version of that morning in 1991, a version where Eleanor said something different on that voicemail, where she named the fear instead of brushing past it, where someone listened closely enough to hear the warning hidden in her tone. In that version, the chain broke early. In that version, Eleanor was not a case, not a lesson, not a symbol. She was just a woman late for work, annoyed by traffic, alive. But imagination was a luxury the real world rarely afforded. In reality, the system had moved the way it always did, slowly, imperfectly, catching up only after the damage had already settled into permanence. By the time the truth surfaced, it arrived too late to save anyone, too late to undo the years shaped by a lie everyone agreed not to challenge. The phrase family secret appeared in headlines for weeks after the case was officially resolved, bold and dramatic, promising revelation. But secrets were never that neat. They were messy, layered, sustained not by a single decision but by thousands of small ones. A silence here, a deflection there, a choice to protect an image rather than a person. Eleanor's story exposed that machinery with uncomfortable clarity, and for a moment, it forced people to look at the quiet compromises in their own lives. Then attention shifted, as it always did. The investigator retired not long after, her career measured in solved cases and unresolved ones alike, But Eleanor's file remained the heaviest, the one that resisted closure even when all procedural boxes had been checked. On her last day, she cleared out her desk slowly, pausing over a handwritten note she had kept tucked inside a drawer for years. It was a quote she had copied down early in her career, one she understood differently now: "The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence." She folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Outside, the city roared as usual. Taxis honked. Pedestrians argued. Life asserted itself with the relentless confidence of something that assumed it would continue indefinitely. She stood there for a moment, watching the flow, thinking about how easily Eleanor had been absorbed back into that current, how quickly the space she left behind had been filled. In a small apartment across town, a woman watched a documentary about the case late one night, volume low, the glow of the screen reflected in her window. She had never known Eleanor, but something about the story stayed with her, the way it refused to resolve cleanly, the way it suggested that danger did not always announce itself with violence, that sometimes it arrived wrapped in familiarity and obligation. She turned off the television and sat in the dark, unsettled, thinking about a friend she hadn't heard from in weeks, wondering if she should call. That was how the case lived on now, not in evidence rooms or court transcripts, but in moments like that, small pauses where awareness flickered, where someone reconsidered a silence they might otherwise have accepted. It was not justice in the traditional sense, but it was not nothing. Eleanor Weiss had been reduced to a headline, then expanded again into a warning, a reminder etched into the city's subconscious. Her story challenged the idea that time alone could heal, that truth inevitably rose to the surface without effort. It suggested something far less comforting, that without pressure, without courage, without someone willing to disrupt the narrative, injustice could settle into permanence and call itself peace. Cold case solved, the headlines said. But the real resolution was quieter, more fragile, and far less complete. It existed only in the willingness to look closer next time, to question the version of events that felt too smooth, too convenient, too easy to accept. It existed in the understanding that some doors were closed not because there was nothing behind them, but because what lay there was too costly to confront. Somewhere in New York, the address where Eleanor had last been seen continued to collect new lives, new stories, each unaware of the history layered beneath their feet. The walls no longer remembered her, but the city did, in its own imperfect way, carrying the echo forward, unresolved, unquiet, waiting for the next moment when silence would demand to be broken. Time did what it always did afterward. It smoothed the sharpest edges, not out of mercy, but out of habit. The city learned how to say Eleanor Weiss's name without stopping. It learned how to pass the address without looking up. It learned how to let the story sit in the past tense, even though the consequences never quite followed it there. In court records, the case was categorized, indexed, cross-referenced, its resolution reduced to lines of text and stamped dates. In real life, it lived differently. It lived in the way certain neighbors still hesitated before answering their doors late at night. It lived in the way families closed ranks instinctively when outsiders asked too many questions. It lived in the unspoken understanding that some truths, once exposed, could never be fully absorbed without changing the shape of everything around them. The family dispersed. Some moved out of state. Some changed names. Some stayed exactly where they were, rooted in place as if motion itself might draw attention. They avoided interviews. They avoided reunions. They avoided each other. Silence, once a shared project, became a private burden. No one spoke publicly about guilt, but it hovered in the pauses between sentences, in the careful way memories were edited before being shared. One brother was seen years later sitting alone in a diner in upstate New York, staring at a television mounted above the counter. A crime segment played silently, closed captions flickering at the bottom of the screen. The phrase "cold case" scrolled past, followed by another name, another year, another face. He did not react. He finished his coffee, left exact change, and walked out into the cold, carrying with him a history no one in that room could see. The investigator understood now that exposure was not the same as absolution. The truth had surfaced, yes, but it had arrived stripped of its power to undo what had already happened. Eleanor remained gone. 30 years remained intact. Accountability existed on paper, but responsibility was scattered, diluted across time and relationships until it belonged to everyone and no one at once. That scattering was the most unsettling part. The case had not been built on malice alone, but on cooperation, on the quiet alignment of people who believed they were choosing the lesser harm, on the collective decision to delay, to wait, to let the problem resolve itself. It never did. Some nights, the investigator replayed the early interviews in her mind, the ones conducted when Eleanor was still officially missing, when hope had not yet been replaced by resignation. She remembered the confidence with which certain statements were delivered, the way answers arrived too quickly, too smoothly, as if rehearsed. At the time, it had seemed like stability. Now, it read as choreography. She wondered how many other cases hid behind similar performances, how many truths had been buried not by force, but by agreement. The thought unsettled her more than any unsolved mystery ever had. Uncertainty could be honest. Certainty, when misplaced, was dangerous. Eleanor's name appeared less frequently now, but when it did, it carried a different weight. Not shock. Not novelty. Recognition. People no longer asked what happened. They asked how it was allowed to happen. The shift was subtle but significant. It moved the focus away from the act itself and toward the environment that made it possible. In that way, Eleanor became more than a victim of a single crime. She became a case study in omission, in what happens when warning signs are rationalized and discomfort is mistaken for safety. Her story forced an uncomfortable realization that the line between protection and harm was thinner than most people wanted to admit. The city continued to generate new mysteries, new disappearances, new cold cases that competed for attention. Some would be solved, some would not. But Eleanor's case lingered as a reference point, invoked quietly among professionals, cited in lectures, whispered about in hallways as a reminder of what vigilance actually required. There was no final image to hold on to. No last photograph that explained everything. Just fragments. A voicemail, a closed door, a family photo cropped to remove someone who no longer fit the narrative. Together, they formed a mosaic that refused to settle into something comfortable. And maybe that was the only honest ending this story could have. Not closure, but awareness. Not resolution, but tension that remained alive, alert, unwilling to be smoothed over. Eleanor Weiss did not return. The years were not given back. But the silence that surrounded her disappearance had been cracked, and through that fracture, something uneasy and necessary continued to move. Somewhere, another door would close too quietly. Another explanation would sound too complete. Another family would choose not to look too closely at what was happening in their midst. When that moment came, Eleanor's story would be there, waiting in the background, unresolved, unforgotten, asking the same question it had always asked, long after the headlines faded and the files were sealed. Who benefits from the silence? And who disappears because of it? Silence did not end with the story, it adapted. It learned new shapes, new tones, new justifications. It became academic language, cautious phrasing, careful distance. It became the way people nodded while listening and then changed the subject, the way conversations drifted away from responsibility and toward inevitability, as if what happened had been the natural conclusion of forces too large to resist. The city absorbed the lesson imperfectly. Some neighborhoods talked about Eleanor Weiss like a warning passed hand to hand, a shorthand for what happened when concern was postponed long enough to become complicity. Other places absorbed nothing at all. Life there remained efficient, distracted, focused on what came next rather than what had been missed. Both responses existed side by side, stitched together by streets that never acknowledged the weight they carried. A young detective, newly assigned to missing persons, read the case file late one night, long after the office lights had dimmed. She had heard the name before, of course. Everyone had. But reading it in sequence, without the noise of headlines, without the reassurance of a labeled ending, unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. The gaps stood out more than the facts. The pauses. The delays. The moments where someone could have acted sooner and chose not to. She closed the file and sat still, feeling the familiar pressure behind her eyes, the one that came when work stopped being abstract. Eleanor was no longer a cautionary tale. She was a measure, a baseline against which future decisions would be judged, whether anyone admitted it or not. Outside, New York continued its constant performance, loud and convincing. It excelled at making everything feel temporary, even loss. Especially loss. But beneath that surface, patterns repeated themselves with unsettling precision. Another woman reported feeling unsafe at home but declined to make it official. Another family insisted everything was fine. Another officer logged the call and moved on, telling themselves they would follow up later. Later was a dangerous word. In quiet moments, the investigator, retired now, but never truly finished, thought about how the case might be remembered decades from now. Not the details, which would blur, but the shape of it. The way it revealed how systems failed not through malice, but through momentum. How people relied on time to solve problems that required intervention. How truth, when delayed, did not arrive unchanged, but weakened, compromised, stripped of its ability to repair what it exposed. Eleanor Weiss had not vanished in a dramatic way. There were no witnesses screaming into the night, no chase through crowded streets. She disappeared the way many people did, quietly, incrementally, as concern was postponed and doubt was rationalized. That was what made the case endure. It did not allow for distance. It suggested that the conditions for disappearance were common, even familiar. The city never marked the lesson officially. There was no plaque, no annual vigil sanctioned by the state. Memory was left to individuals, unevenly distributed, dependent on who had listened closely enough when the story resurfaced. Some carried it forward. Some let it go. And yet the echo persisted. It surfaced when someone hesitated before dismissing a complaint. When a neighbor chose to knock instead of look away. When an investigator pressed one more question, unwilling to accept the easy version of events. These were small acts, barely visible, but they mattered in ways that rarely made headlines. The phrase cold case continued to circulate, applied to new mysteries, new losses. But for those who knew Eleanor's story, the words carried an added weight. Cold did not mean forgotten. It meant unattended. It meant waiting. It meant a truth stalled long enough to change the lives built around its absence. In the end, Eleanor Weiss remained what she had always been. A presence defined not by what was known, but by what had been avoided. Her story resisted closure because closure implied completion, and nothing about this felt complete. The damage extended outward, quiet and persistent, shaping choices long after the official ending had been written. Somewhere, a door closed too softly again. Somewhere, a family chose cohesion over confrontation. Somewhere, a question went unasked because asking it felt disruptive, impolite, dangerous. The city did not pause to notice. It rarely did. But the echo was still there, threaded through the noise, insistent and unresolved, carrying forward the same warning it always had, waiting for the moment when someone finally decided that silence was no longer an acceptable price to pay.